Let's come back from the break, please.
Excuse me, Madam Hearing Officer?
Yes. Is this Vice Chair Davis?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. I just want to let you know that I used the other audio option when I had trouble calling in. So if anybody else has issue, that helped out, and it just allowed me to call from a phone and have better sound.
So other audio. So that may.
Yeah, if you look down here by the leave event, there's another button there that has 3 little dots that says more options.
Yes.
And it says switch audio. And if you click on that, it gives you a phone number to call and where you click switch.
That's excellent information. Thank you, Vice Chair. And I hope that that's helpful to Member Duvall. Thank you. All right. We are back after a break, and I had a request from one of the council to discuss the schedule for this afternoon. Ms. Katz, I believe we turn now to your 3 witnesses.
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer.
Okay, and after that, sorry, let me pull the spreadsheet back into my hands. And then EDF has witness Lackner.
Yes, thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. We have witness Lackner on the economic analysis. We also have Dr. Tammy Thompson, who was unable to testify yesterday on the ozone modeling.
Yes. So I guess I'm unclear then on your question.
I guess I'm trying to understand when we would fit Dr. Tammy Thompson in, if it would be today after the economic discussion and before we get to definitions.
Madam Hearing Officer, may I ask, again, I'm concerned that Ms. Day is, we could run very close or after 3 p.m. and she really needs to not have to testify after 3 p.m. So if we could maybe get through the small business facilities and then have Ms. Thompson do her modeling rebuttal, that would be best if we could do that.
That's absolutely fine. That was the clarification I was looking for. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Barnos and Ms. Katz. Is there anything else we need to talk about, board members, before we go to the department's economic rebuttal? No? And Ms. Day, I see you on the screen. Thank you for joining us. Let's try your sound, please.
Oh. Madam Hearing Officer, can I also make clear, though, that it's actually Mr. Powell who will be going first on this topic?
That's fine. I just wanted, since we hadn't seen Ms. Day before and I didn't see Mr. Powell on the screen, I was just checking her sound.
Great. Yes, thank you.
Before you get there, Madam Hearing Officer, if I might,
yes.
Did we complete Mr. Heiser's examination of Mr. Dunham? I thought his testimony was limited to his direct and rebuttal, but not surrebuttal. So I didn't know if his surrebuttal, if there is going to be any, when that's going to happen in sort of the schedule we just discussed.
All right. I might have clarified that. My assumption was that the surrebuttal would come after the department's rebuttal. But if Mr. Heiser feels differently, I'm happy to talk about it.
Madam Hearing Officer, Mr. Heiser's thoughts are exactly the same as yours. It'd be after the department and Ms. Lackner's response.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
right.
Madam.
So thank you, Mr. Rose. Mr. Powell, let's try your sounds.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you. We've just had a lot of sound gremlins the last 2 days. Uh, so thank you for that. And Ms. Day, while you're on screen, just let's try your sound. You're unmuted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, and it's very clear. Thank you so much. All right, let's begin with Mr. Powell. Mr. Powell, I think we have standard spelling on your first and last name. Would you raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Ms. Katz. Oh, and remember to mention the exhibits.
Yes, thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. For the board, Mr. Powell's exhibit, his testimony appears at NMED Rebuttal Exhibit 17. Okay. Mr. Powell, will you please state your full name for the record?
Brandon Powell,
And Mr. Powell, where are you employed?
the Oil Conservation Division of New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department.
And we'll be referring to the that Oil Conservation Division as OCD. How long have you worked for OCD, Mr. Powell?
Over 15 years.
And what is your current job title?
My current title is the Engineering Bureau Chief.
And what are your job duties?
I am responsible for the oversight and management of the Engineering Bureau, which includes the administrative and permitting and underground injection control, and then also oversee the inspection program.
Great. Can you please summarize your relevant professional qualifications for the board?
For this, the relevant qualifications is my time with the OCD. I've participated in multiple environmental and engineering related rulemakings before the New Mexico Oil Conservation Commission, which commonly is referred to as the NMOCC, including the recent proceedings on the OCD waste rule. I also regularly use the databases maintained by the OCD that contains the statistics on oil and gas and natural gas wells.
And a copy of your resume has been provided as NMED Rebuttal Exhibit 18.
That is correct.
And have you submitted pre-filed rebuttal testimony in this proceeding?
Yes, I have.
And your full written rebuttal testimony appears as NMED Rebuttal Exhibit 17, correct?
That is correct.
Do you have any changes to your written testimony?
I do not.
And do you adopt your written testimony here today?
Yes.
And you reviewed Mr. Dunham's economic analysis that we just heard about from Mr. Dunham, correct?
That is correct.
In your testimony responds to some of the numbers and data presented by Mr. Dunham in his analysis?
Yes, I do.
As the basis for his analysis, Mr. Dunham determined that 81,975 wells would be affected by the department's proposed rule. Can you summarize for the board your review and conclusions regarding that number?
I certainly can. So I'll go through the numbers that we pulled from our system, or I pulled from our system. In the written testimony, there's two numbers that I provide. I provide a permitted total, and then I provide an active total. That's important. The permitted total is a total of all permitted wells that may or may not be drilled yet. The active total, which I'm going to focus on more in my discussion today, is how many wells are actually drilled, completed, and producing and listed as active wells. That's not to say new wells can't come on, but that at the time I pulled it, that's how many wells were in active status. So for oil wells, when I pulled the numbers, we had 26,808 active oil wells. In Mr. Dunham's exhibit, he had 33,293. So that's a difference of roughly just under 6,500 wells. For gas wells, we have 26,530 active wells. Mr. Dunham in his testimony had 50,954 wells. That's a difference of 24,424. So in total, we have 53,338 active wells for oil and gas, where Mr. Dunham and his exhibit had 84,247. That's a difference of just a little over 30,000 wells. So based on that 30,000 wells, our well count is approximately a 37% reduction from what Mr. Dunham used in his exhibit.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. Can you discuss your testimony regarding the production values that were assigned by Mr. Dunham for low production wells in his analysis?
Certainly. So his production values for his low production wells, I believe in his exhibit, had the quantity as being 1 to 15 barrels of oil equivalent per day. This aligns to what we typically use in New Mexico as a stripper well. Our stripper wells are defined as anything that's less than 10 barrels a day of oil or 60 MCF a day of natural gas. We have roughly 14,858 gas stripper wells in the state and 15,163 oil stripper wells in the state. That's a total of just over 30,000 stripper wells in the state. This number is significantly lower than Mr. Dunham's in his exhibit. He had, between oil and gas combined, he had 59,000 low production wells, or just over 59,000 low production wells, which is the 59,000 low production wells is actually roughly 6,000 wells over what we have as total wells in the entire state for oil and gas.
Thank you for that, Mr. Powell. Can you summarize your evaluation of Mr. Dunham's analysis with respect to the assumptions he made about the prevalence of certain types of equipment at all wells?
Certainly. So those assumptions specifically were in Mr. Dunham's table 7. Looking at his equipment in those assumptions and then back calculating to get the number of wells used, it appears for that table, he is assigning equipment costs on multiple lines, for multiple lines for every well in that category, or at least most wells in that category. Based on my experience, that's not common operating practice, as not all wells are configured the same. An example of this is for most natural gas wells in New Mexico, it's not common to have an individual flare stack on each natural gas well, as natural gas is the targeted commodity and most are shut in if there's an issue, not flared. By back calculating, it appears the study assigned flare stacks to roughly 49,000 natural gas wells. As described previously, we only have 26,000 active natural gas wells, which that's a direct reduction of almost 46% of the well total based on count alone, and then not even looking at the actual equipment itself. Because natural gas wells don't have a lot of standalone flares, that would reduce those costs substantially just on the flare stack. Continuing the assumption for oil wells, there are numerous oil wells that don't have individual flares, or wells that do flare. There's a portion of those wells that are pumped to a central facility or tank battery, or there may be one flare associated with multiple wells. That could be, for example, 10 wells get pumped to a tank battery where all the fluids are handled, and that's where that flare stack would be located. Again, to kind of reiterate, not all locations are created the same in the same scenario. This applies to also enclosed combustion devices, VRUs, that's vapor recovery units in the exhibit, compressors, because they're not all required at all locations based on pressures, flow rates, all of that. So in summary, based on the base numbers to create that table 7, which are the basis for the monetary numbers, the table doesn't appear to reflect true well applications in New Mexico. And that because of that, it would likely significantly change the cost per well that is summarized at the bottom of that table, because only a portion of the wells would have a portion of those pieces of equipment.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. I have no more questions for Mr. Powell.
All right, thank you, Ms. Katz. Ms. Fox, do you have questions of Mr. Powell?
No, I don't, Madam Hearing Officer. Mr. Powell, thank you for your testimony.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Paranos?
No questions. Thank you, Mr. Powell, for your testimony.
Good. Mr. James?
No questions, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Ms. DeVore? Mr. Nykiel?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. DeSalen?
No questions, thank you. And I also wanted to thank the witness for his testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Heiser?
Madam Hearing Officer, I do have a couple of questions. Thank you. So, Mr. Powell, if I turn your attention to, have you seen Table 7 in Mr. Dunham's report? Was that what you were just discussing?
Yes, I have.
If you look at the cost there, for example, in Table 7 in Mr. Dunham's report, you see an entry for compressors. And what's the cost given per oil well for that?
It shows $55.
Is $55 reflective of the cost of actually purchasing and installing a compressor at a site?
I have no idea. I don't know the cost of installing equipment.
But does that seem sort of low for a piece of equipment the size of a compressor?
I have no idea, because there's operator-owned compressors, and then there's leased-owned compressors. If an operator owns it, that might be low. I don't know. If it's a lease, that might be, I don't know the cost of installation.
So you don't know from looking at this table whether the costs are apportioned to the well for whatever services may have been provided to that well site versus saying that each of these things are present at a well.
I don't see where the table makes that assumption of how the cost is broken down.
Correct. Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Heiser. Mr. Rose, do you have questions of Mr. Powell?
No questions, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Mr. Jano?
No questions.
Mr. Boutsier?
No questions, thank you.
Ms. Gutierrez?
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Kolkosher?
No questions, thank you.
And Ms. Witherspoon?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to the board for their questions while I'm doing that. If you are an attendee rather than a panelist on this platform and you have a question of the witness, please reach out in the chat. Chat is enabled for everyone. Madam Chair, do you have questions of Mr. Powell?
Yes, thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Yes, Mr. Powell, I just had maybe two questions. So the information you presented this morning in your testimony, is that data readily available, say on the NMED website or on OCD's website?
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, all of that data is readily available on the New Mexico Oil Conservation Division's website using the search functions in the website itself, and it's publicly available to all.
Okay, all right. Actually, that's the only question I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis. I can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I couldn't find my mute button. Unmute. I do not have any questions. Thank you, Mr. Powell.
Thank you.
Member Cates.
No questions here, thank you.
Thank you. Member Bitzer.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Member Duvall. He can hear us and he's saying in the chat, no questions. Member Garcia.
Yes, thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I have one question for Mr. Powell. Thank you for your testimony, and I just find it curious that there would be such a discrepancy with the number of actual active wells. I do know that that information is readily available on the website, the OCD website. And I would think OCD would be the entity with the expertise and the number of active wells, et cetera. Can you, or is there any other source of information that where somebody wants to know how many active wells are in New Mexico? Is there any other source out there where somehow this information is not accurate to some people? I just don't understand that.
I am not aware of other sources. I don't know where the numbers were pulled up from for analysis. The only other scenario I can potentially think of is they pulled active formations or completions into Mexico. That might build up to that many, but one well could be completed in multiple formations or have multiple completions per well. And my only thought is maybe they pulled active completions in the state.
And the numbers you're giving are the 2018 numbers that they relied on for their analysis. Is that right? Wasn't it 2018 or?
The numbers that I talked about that they gave, that was in their exhibit. The numbers I pulled, I believe I pulled last month in prep for my rebuttal testimony.
Okay, so we're talking about two different time periods for the number of active wells then.
If they didn't pull the well count until 2018, then it might be two different numbers, but it still wouldn't affect it that greatly. Our well count has actually gone up since 2018, not down.
Is that it, Member Garcia? Yes. All right, Member Honker.
Thanks for your testimony, Mr. Powell. I have no questions.
All right, thank you. Ms. Katz, did any of that questioning raise a need for redirect for you?
Just a few questions, Madam Hearing Officer. Mr. Powell, did Mr. Dunham in his analysis state that he got his information regarding the number of wells from the OCD website?
In his statement this morning, he said that part of that was from the OCD website.
Okay, and I believe in his testimony or his actual report, he states that the data was taken from the OCD's website. Did he say what searches he used to come up with that number on the OCD website?
I don't believe so, no.
Were you able to recreate his numbers?
I didn't try to recreate his numbers. I tried to run my own numbers to get the accurate numbers.
Okay. Did you try to see where his numbers where he might have been getting his numbers?
I did not.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
All right, thank you, Ms. Katz. There's nothing further. We'll excuse Mr. Powell for the moment. Thank you very much, Mr. Powell.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
Are we turning now to Ms. Day?
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer. The department calls Susan Day and Brian Palmer.
All right, thank you. Susan Day is the standard spelling. Ms. Day, if you would please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. And let's see, Mr. Palmer, also standard spelling on first and last name. I see your right hand is raised. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much, Ms. Katz.
Okay.
Mention the exhibits. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for keeping up, reminding me. That's very helpful, actually. This testimony is provided in NMED Rebuttal Exhibit 19. Okay. Ms. Day, I'll start with you. Will you please state your full name for the record?
Susan Day.
And where are you employed, Ms. Day?
I am employed at Eastern Research Group.
And we'll be referring to Eastern Research Group as ERG here. How long have you worked for ERG?
I've worked for ERG approximately 4 years with an additional 29 years in the environmental consulting industry.
And what is your current job title?
Senior economist.
And can you describe your educational and professional qualifications?
Yes, I hold a BA in economics from Colby College and an MS in resource economics from the University of Rhode Island. And I'm an economist and project manager with 34 years of experience conducting and managing economic, regulatory, and data analyses that support environmental regulations under federal environmental statutes.
And a copy of your resume has been provided as NMED Exhibit 103, correct?
Yes, correct.
Have you submitted pre-filed rebuttal testimony regarding the economic analysis submitted by NMOGA and its direct testimony in this proceeding?
Yes, I have.
And your full written rebuttal testimony is marked as NMED Rebuttal Exhibit 19?
Yes, it is.
Do you have any changes to your rebuttal testimony?
No, I do not.
And do you adopt that testimony here today?
Yes, I do.
Okay, turning to Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer, will you please state your full name for the record?
It's Brian Palmer.
And where are you employed?
I am also employed with Eastern Research Group. Just a little background, Eastern Research Group is a privately owned company. We have about 400 employees. We focus primarily on government and state consulting. We generally do not do any private industry work, so we try to maintain keep ourselves free of conflicts of interest.
Thank you for that. How long have you worked for ERG, Mr. Palmer?
Just over 25 years. Prior to that, I worked for 5 years for Radiant International.
And what is your current job title?
I am a senior environmental scientist.
And can you describe your educational and professional qualifications?
Yes, I have a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from Bates College and a Master of Arts from the ecology curriculum at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I have 30 years of experience supporting the federal and state governments in developing air quality regulations, including the background research, identification of control technologies, estimate of cost and environmental impacts, and preparing all the documentation needed to support proposed and final regulations.
Thank you. And a copy of your resume has been provided as NMED Exhibit 33, correct?
Yes.
And have you submitted pre-filed rebuttal testimony regarding the NMOGA economic analysis in this proceeding?
Yes.
And your full written rebuttal testimony is marked as NMED Rebuttal Exhibit 19?
Yes.
Do you have any changes to your testimony?
No.
And do you adopt that testimony here today?
Yes.
Okay. So I believe we're presenting a PowerPoint, so is that Mr. Palmer is going to be presenting that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought Ms. Keene was going to be driving, but I can pull it up.
Presenting.
Oh, sorry.
Do you want Ms. Keene to drive it, or am I driving it?
Yeah, sorry, whoever we picked there, but they just need to be given. There we go.
Okay.
Oh.
There we are. Thank you.
I saw it for a minute and then it went away.
Okay, let me try again.
Can you put it in presenting mode?
It's showing in presenting mode.
There it is. Okay, it takes a minute.
Okay.
All right. Ms. Day, can you summarize your impressions of the microeconomic model that Mr. Dunham claims to have used to estimate the costs and impacts of proposed Part 50?
Yes, my impression of Mr. Dunham's analysis is that NMOGA has not provided enough detail in terms of underlying data, assumptions, and Excel spreadsheets or code to allow a real analysis of what he did or his conclusions. But I would say that it's clear that Mr. Dunham's analysis significantly overstates the number of wells affected by the proposed rule, as well as the costs of the proposed rule. But without the ability to review the model in detail, including how the universe of affected entities and unit compliance costs were generated, I believe that the board should reject Mr. Dunham's conclusions and not give any weight to the estimated cost and impacts asserted by Mr. Dunham in that analysis.
Thank you. Ms. Day, do you agree with the estimates of direct administrative and operational costs estimated by Mr. Dunham?
No, Mr. Dunham estimates the direct administrative and operational costs of the rule to be a minimum of $3.8 billion in 2020 dollars over a 5-year period. He also states that the bulk of these costs will occur in the first year or two. By comparison, the ERG estimate of the total annual costs is $338 million per year. And over a 5-year period, that cost would be no more than $1.7 billion, or about 1/2 of what Mr. Dunham estimated. And I'd also like to just point out that NMED has been very transparent regarding the development of these cost estimates. The spreadsheets underlying the estimates were posted for evaluation by stakeholders and the public, and the direct testimony submitted by NMED contains in-depth explanations of where the data came from, what the assumptions were, and how the proposed rule requirements were developed based on those data assumptions.
Thank you. Next slide, please.
I apologize. It appears to be frozen.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Turning Mr. Palmer, what did you determine were the number of wells that would be affected by the proposed rule, and how did you come up with that number?
ERG estimated that there'd be about 48,000 producing wells in the 7 counties that would be affected by the proposed Part 50. We obtained our data for this cost estimate from the Oil and Conservation Division, OCD, of the New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. My rebuttal testimony that I submitted earlier detailed how we determined the number. As you just heard from Brandon Powell, the Bureau Chief of OCD's Engineering Bureau, his testimony exhibited as NMED Rebuttal Exhibit 17 confirmed that our estimate of the number of affected wells is correct.
And Mr. Palmer, what is your impression of Mr. Dunham's estimate of the number of affected wells?
Mr. Dunham estimates that there are 84,247 wells that will be affected by proposed Part 50, which is nearly 2 times the number of wells that NMED and ERG determined would be affected by the rule. While he references the OCD well statistics from January 28th, 2021 on the OCD website, he provides no explanation of the search he did on the OCD website. Again, Mr. Powell has confirmed that the well count Mr. Dunham used in his analysis is incorrect and significantly overstated.
Thank you. Ms. Day, does it matter that Mr. Dunham's and NMED's affected well estimates do not agree?
Yes, it does. The number of wells is a foundational data point underpinning the entire economic analysis. Overstating the number of affected wells leads to an overestimation of compliance costs associated with proposed Part 50.
So can we move to the next slide, please?
Yes, I apologize. It's for some reason there's a significant delay.
That's fine, we'll wait.
We're on the next
Mr.
slide.
Palmer, sorry. Mr. Palmer, are the costs in the proposed rule incurred at the level of the well site or the wellhead?
The rule requirements and costs are generally applied at the level of what I'll refer to as the well site, not at the wellhead. The well site includes more equipment such as storage tanks, separators, etc., than just the actual wellhead. For efficiency, that equipment will be shared among multiple wells associated with that site. Therefore, pollution control costs should be estimated generally at the level of the well site and not at the wellhead.
And Mr. Palmer, does Mr. Dunham's analysis correctly attribute costs to the well site or the wellhead?
In the table 7 of his analysis, Mr. Dunham appears to apply his costs at the level of the well rather than at the well site. Because he's applying the costs to the number of wells rather than to the number of estimated well sites, he may be overestimating the cost by several times depending on how many wells are associated with the well site. However, because Mr. Dunham provides no supporting documentation of these costs, it is not possible to accurately determine how this factor affects the overall cost estimates.
Thank you. Mr. Palmer, how does Mr. Dunham estimate the unit and total compliance costs associated with the proposed rule?
We don't have any documentation of how he developed those costs. Mr. Dunham asserts that his analysis relies on a survey of 10 companies from NMOGA's membership to develop estimates of equipment and operational costs to comply with the proposed Part 50. But Mr. Dunham provides neither a copy of the survey instrument, the questionnaire, nor does he provide any responses or raw data submitted by the companies that that were purportedly surveyed. Without this information, it is impossible to assess the accuracy or variability of his results, how the data were reduced to the values used in his analysis, particularly in Table 7 of his report, or how they relate to ERG's cost estimates that we detailed in our spreadsheets that have been provided to the public since early June. Even if the data were declared confidential by the respondents to the survey, there are methods to aggregate the data from multiple respondents to conceal confidential information.
Thank you. And can you describe how Mr. Palmer, how other regulatory programs with which you have worked have protected confidential and proprietary data?
Yes, as developing air quality regulations over the past 30 years, we've often had to deal with proprietary information from industry surveys, et cetera. One area I've been working with the last few years is a greenhouse gas reporting program, and that program is collecting very, very detailed production data from numerous facilities. Some of it is extremely sensitive. They are able to make quite a bit of that information public on an EPA website. And they go through various steps of aggregating the data in order to conceal proprietary information or sensitive information for particular industries. So for example, they'll aggregate the data. If they only have a few reporters for a particular data item, they'll just report a total and they won't report the number of reporters so that you couldn't figure out what the average is. You know, case in point, there's only 3 reporters in a particularly specialized industry. So they won't report even an average because, you know, one of those could figure out what the other 2 are doing. So there are a lot of ways to protect confidential information by aggregating sensitive data. But more importantly, too, is that the questionnaires that those facilities are filling out, that is totally public information, and is available so people know exactly what data are being collected.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. And this is for you're referring to the greenhouse gas reporting program at the federal level. So you're talking about
Yes.
nationwide data collection.
Yes.
And Mr. Palmer, do you have any other concerns regarding how the costs were applied in Mr. Dunham's analysis?
Yes. Another issue is that Mr. Dunham applies certain costs for certain types of controls or emission sources to each individual well, even though those types of emission sources are not located at each well or well site. And I think this reflects the testimony you just heard from Mr. Powell as well. While it is true that Mr. Dunham presents these as average costs per well, this approach likely leads to a substantial overestimate of the total costs that will in turn lead to an unreliable estimate of the economic impacts of the proposed rule.
Thank you. And can we go to the next slide?
Nope, we're on this slide.
Oh, sorry. Do we need to go back?
No, we're fine.
Okay.
We're fine, but I will just continue my testimony here.
Oh, sorry. I thought we were on another question. Go ahead,
No.
Mr. Palmer.
No. Mr. Dunham's costs in Table 7 of his report do not align with ERG's cost estimates that we have made public. And what I'd like to just talk about are a few examples that we have. So we compared his cost estimates to what we've been able to estimate, and then also looked at some cost estimates that were prepared by the EPA, the federal EPA, for a nationwide rule for a similar source category or emission source type. And I'd just like to take the next 3 slides, I believe, to just go over those examples. But what it is, okay, we'll go to that one next. So the first example is with glycol dehydrators, and in Table 7 of Mr. Dunham's report, he estimated a capital cost for glycol dehydrators of $794 million in New Mexico. When we did our cost estimate for glycol dehydrators, we came up with a capital cost estimate of about $4.6 million for controls at existing glycol dehydrators. And this is based on the New Mexico Environment Department's equipment data that comes out of their permitting database. And so these are all the glycol dehydrators that are in their permitting database. We estimated what the cost of a control device would be. And that is documented in our equipment spreadsheets. Just for comparison, the federal EPA has 2 rules for the oil and gas industry that focus on glycol dehydrators. And one of them is a major source rule, and the other is an area source rule. And when the federal EPA initially developed the major source rule, they also, in the proposal, included the area sources. So major sources are those that are emitting greater than 25 tons per year of a single HAP, or 10 tons per year of a single hazardous air pollutant, or 25 tons per year of a total. So they estimated that capital cost nationwide for all glycol dehydrators in their rule, and based on that information, the nationwide rule cost estimate would be $670 million. So that's actually less than JDA's cost estimate for New Mexico alone. The next example is for storage tanks. The JDA capital cost estimate was $185 million. ERG's capital cost estimate was $69 million. And this, I just want to point out, this cost estimate is based on our latest cost for the draft rule that was submitted on September 6th. So this is slightly different. It's a slightly lower cost because we raised the applicability threshold. So our number is about a third of the JDA analysis, and without further information on the number of sources or the types of controls, it's very hard for us to evaluate the reason for the difference in costs. The final comment or slide I'd like to cover is in table 7 of Mr. Dunham's analysis. He has, I believe there's about 10 rows of information, and there's estimated VOC control costs for very specific pieces of equipment: compressors, gas well liquid unloading, glycol dehydrators, hydrocarbon liquid transfers, pipeline pigging, launching and receiving, pneumatic controllers and pumps, and finally storage tanks. So these are all VOC emission sources, and they all have a particular type of control applied. But he also includes costs for open flares of $252 million, enclosed combustors and thermal oxidizers of $794 million, and vapor recovery units of $481 million. So the total additional first-year cost for those 3 control items is $1.5 billion. However, it's not clear from the table where you would use those controls, because he already has separate controls for the other items listed there: compressors, gas well liquid unloading, etc. So it's not clear how those costs fit together, and it appears that there's the potential for double counting of the costs for those VOC controls. I'd like to go to the next slide. So just before I let Susan talk about this slide, so my overall professional opinion is that the costs presented in Mr. Dunham's analysis are not sufficiently documented, and there's no indication of how most of them are related to the specific provisions of the proposed rule or the detailed and documented cost estimates provided by NMED to the stakeholders. In some cases, Mr. Dunham's cost estimates are orders of magnitude higher than NMED's estimates, as well as comparable estimates in federal regulatory actions for similar sources. Again, in my professional opinion, I think the board should give no weight to the economic impact analysis because it contains no credible documentation of the numbers that are the critical input to that analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Ms. Day, turning back to you, does Mr. Dunham's analysis consider the reduced regulatory requirements proposed for small business facilities as defined in the proposed rule?
No, it does not. And by failing to take into account the lower compliance costs for qualifying small businesses, Mr. Dunham overestimates the economic impacts of the proposed rule.
And can we move to the next slide, please? Oh, are we on the wrong slide here?
I think this is the correct slide.
Okay. Ms. Day, what is your response to Mr. Dunham's estimated job losses due to the proposed rule? I think we're
So,
behind.
yeah, so the, we need to.
Oh, sorry, I skipped
job
something.
losses. You want to go back
Let's
to
move-
this?
Yeah, sorry.
One at a time, please.
Ms. Day, I apologize. Let's go back to the question that aligns with this slide. Ms. Day, what is your response to Mr. Dunham's net present value calculations of the costs associated with Part 50?
Mr. Dunham makes two assumptions in his net present value calculation that I don't agree with. First, he assumes a 5-year time frame, but he doesn't provide justification for that time frame. A more typical time frame routinely used in federal air quality rulemakings would be between 10 and 20 years and assumed to be 15 for purposes of analysis based on the useful life of the add-on control equipment and equipment modifications required under Part 50. And second, he assumes that nearly 85% of the costs of the rule will be incurred by industry in the first year. So given that investments in equipment are typically spread out by affected owners, operators, a more realistic assumption would be that the cost of the regulation can be spread out more evenly over the 15-year useful life timeframe. Under this scenario, the present value of cost would be significantly lower than Mr. Dunham has estimated.
Thank you. And now, there we go. And Ms. Day, what is your response to Mr. Dunham's estimated job losses due to the proposed rule?
Mr. Dunham doesn't provide enough detail regarding his analysis for me to be able to evaluate the accuracy of his estimates of job losses in the oil and gas industry or in supporting industries. He refers to a previous study of his where he used the in-plan model to quantify the economic impacts of the Western oil and natural gas industry on the economy of the United States. And as I explained in my written rebuttal testimony, that analysis applied to oil and gas operations in 13 states, not just New Mexico. In his analysis of potential impacts associated with Part 50, Mr. Dunham does not clarify whether he used New Mexico multipliers or multipliers that represent the 13 Western states to consider economic impacts. And I'll just explain that multiplier refers to the ratio between an induced economic impact and a direct impact. And that's, a little more detail is that induced impacts occur when workers involved in direct and indirect activities spend their wages in the local economy or the economy. So it would be appropriate to use multipliers specific to New Mexico. However, Mr. Dunham does not provide the information I would need to determine whether or not that's what he did. He also does some modeling outside of the in-plan model and again doesn't provide enough information on the structure of this modeling for me to evaluate the accuracy of his estimates of job losses in the oil and gas industry or supporting industries. Most importantly, if Mr. Dunham estimated employment impacts using the compliance cost estimate as the key input, and it's hard to know if that's what he did because he doesn't say, to the extent that compliance costs are overestimated, employment impacts would be overstated as well.
Thank you, Ms. Day. And can you discuss your impression of the rebuttal testimony submitted by the other parties regarding Mr. Dunham's economic analysis?
Yes, the testimony of Maureen Lackner from the Environmental Defense Fund, or EDF, supports several of the points that I've made in my testimony and also highlights some limitations of Mr. Dunham's analysis. First, Ms. Lackner's testimony supports our observation that Mr. Dunham has overestimated the well count and that this leads to a significant overestimate of total cost, even when his own unit cost estimates are used. Second, Ms. Lackner agrees that the time period over which costs are incurred is misrepresented in Mr. Dunham's analysis. Mr. Dunham assumes that the vast majority of costs will be incurred in the first year. In addition to the explanation I provided regarding industry typically financing costs over the useful life of equipment, Ms. Lackner explains that NMED allows operators up to 7 years to phase in control requirements. Third, Ms. Lackner's testimony points out that industry compliance costs may be offset by revenues received from captured gas. She indicates that this figure could be as high as $300 million per year. And then this is a cost savings that is not accounted for in Mr. Dunham's analysis. Fourth, Ms. Lackner explains that social costs are not considered in Mr. Dunham's analysis. And while I can't comment on EDF's dollar estimates, I agree that avoiding the social costs, for example, climate damages, environmental and health effects of oil and gas operations would be a benefit of the rule that can be quantified and monetized at least to some extent. Fifth and finally, Ms. Lackner is in agreement that Mr. Dunham's input-output model has limitations and that Mr. Dunham neither explains the assumptions of his model nor tests the strengths of these assumptions. She also raises the idea with supporting research that the proposed rule could lead to job creation in the methane mitigation industry.
Thank you, Ms. Day and Mr. Palmer. I have no further questions.
All right, thank you, Ms. Katz. Madam Chair, we do need to take something of a lunch break before the 1 o'clock public comment period. I can certainly see if the first few parties have brief questioning to get us closer to 12:30, but we're not going to be able to get through cross-examination before we need to break for lunch. Is your preference to break now?
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, that would be my preference, just because there's been a lot of information and I don't want to break up her cross-examinations or the gentleman's cross-examination.
All right, thank you all. We are on break until 1. At 1 o'clock, I'll begin with just a few public commenters, and then we'll return to the questioning of Ms. Day and Mr. Palmer. Thank you all.